In the next 10 seconds, I need you to be my husband. She glanced once over her shoulder, saw two people turning into the hallway behind her, and then crossed straight to Nolan without hesitation. Before he could even stand, she took his hand in both of hers, cold fingers gripping hard enough to make him blink, and whispered in a low, controlled voice that somehow sounded more frightened because of how controlled it was. The strangest thing about the morning Nolan Hayes might lose everything was that it began exactly the way every other school day morning began. Emma wanted the strawberry yogurt, not the peach. She reminded him her spelling quiz was on Friday, even though it was only Tuesday. He made her take the navy cardigan because Boston weather liked to lie before noon, and when she rolled her eyes and called him dramatic, he pretended not to smile because single dads learned early that some moments were too small and too good to interrupt. By 8:15, he had her backpack over one shoulder, her water bottle in the side pocket, and the folded permission slip for next week's field trip tucked into his jacket, like the world still made sense in paper forms and lunch breaks and after-school pickup lines. Then they walked into St. Catherine's Cardiac Center, and the world stopped sounding ordinary. There was nothing loud about the waiting area. No alarms. No chaos. Just polished floors, low voices, and a TV bolted high in a corner with the sound turned off, while a weather map flashed a cold front moving down from Maine. But fear did not need noise. Fear only needed a chair with your name on it, and a door that closed behind your child. Emma sat on the edge of the exam bed swinging her sneakers like this was any other appointment, brave in the careless way kids sometimes were, and Nolan signed the final consent form with the same hand he used to cut her grilled cheese into triangles. A nurse clipped a monitor to Emma and smiled too gently. Nolan noticed that. Men like him notice things. Not because they were paranoid. Because once life teaches you how fast normal can break, you never really stop watching for the first crack. Emma looked up at him and asked if they would still make it to dance practice if the test took too long. He told her they would make it work. That was what he always said. Not because he always knew how. Because she needed to hear that somebody would. Then the nurse wheeled her through a set of double doors, and Nolan was left alone in a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, and antiseptic, holding his truck keys so tightly the edges pressed half-moons into his palm. He sat down, stared at the gray tile, and tried not to imagine the doctor walking back with the careful face people wore when they were about to change your life with one sentence. That was when high heels clicked across the corridor, quick and precise, the sound of someone used to being expected before she was seen. Nolan looked up. The woman moving toward him did not belong to the softness of the pediatric wing. She wore a camel coat over a black dress, no-nonsense heels, and the kind of composure money could not buy unless power had taught it first. Her hair was pulled back, her jaw set tight, but there was something off in the way she breathed, like she was holding herself together by force. She glanced once over her shoulder, saw two people turning into the hallway behind her, and then crossed straight to Nolan without hesitation. Before he could even stand, she took his hand in both of hers, cold fingers gripping hard enough to make him blink, and whispered in a low, controlled voice that somehow sounded more frightened because of how controlled it was. In the next 10 seconds, I need you to be my husband. For half a second, Nolan thought he had heard her wrong. Then he saw the two people coming down the hallway behind her and understood that whatever this was, it mattered enough to make a woman like her afraid. The older man had silver hair, a navy overcoat, and the kind of posture that came from spending decades in rooms where everyone else waited for him to speak. Beside him walked a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a leather folder against her chest, like a weapon disguised as paperwork. The woman gripping Nolan's hand did not look at them again. She only lifted her chin, moved closer, and said in a voice meant for him alone, "Please." It was the first honest thing about her. Nolan should have pulled away. He had a daughter behind those doors, and no room in his life for rich strangers with expensive emergencies. But then the older man smiled the way people smiled when they wanted information, not connection, and the woman beside him narrowed her eyes at the sight of Nolan's hand in the stranger's. By the time they reached them, the stranger had already turned and leaned lightly against Nolan's shoulder with the ease of someone who had rehearsed composure her whole life. "Dad," she said, calm now, almost bored. "Marjorie, I did not realize you would get here this fast." Her father's gaze flicked over Nolan in one clean sweep, from his scuffed work boots to the hospital visitor sticker on his jacket. "Not rude." Worse than rude. Efficient. Vivian, he said, then nodded once at Nolan. You never mentioned your husband would be joining you. Husband. The word landed strangely in a hallway where Nolan had signed forms alone less than 10 minutes earlier. Vivian's fingers tightened around his wrist just enough to remind him the lie had already begun. That is because my medical appointments are not usually board business, she said. Marjorie gave a small professional smile that did not reach her eyes. Your father was concerned when you canceled the strategy call this morning. We all were. Nolan could feel the shape of the conversation without knowing the history. Concern was not concern. Concern was surveillance dressed for daylight. Vivian finally looked up at him, and he saw it then, the crack under the polish. Not weakness exactly. More like exhaustion held together by habit. Nolan took the morning off to be here with me, she said. It was smooth, nearly flawless, except for the tiny delay before his name, as if she had only just learned it from reading his face. Her father studied him again. That is very devoted of you. Nolan had spent years learning that silence could protect more than speech, but there were moments when saying less made people think they could write your character for you. So he met the man's eyes and answered evenly. Family should not have to sit in places like this alone. Something unreadable passed over Vivian's face at that, quick as a shadow. Her father gave the faintest nod, not approval, not trust, just recalculation. Then Marjorie's attention dropped to the clipboard tucked under Nolan's arm, and her tone sharpened by a degree. Cardiology? She asked. Before Nolan could respond, a nurse stepped through the double doors holding a tablet and called, Mr. Hayes? The entire hallway changed in one breath. Vivian's hand slipped from his arm. Marjorie looked at the name on the chart, then at Vivian. Her father stopped smiling. And Nolan, who had agreed to nothing and trusted no one, realized the woman who had just called him her husband was standing 3 feet away from the same wing, where his daughter was being tested for a device her company might have built. The nurse did not repeat his name. She did not have to. Nolan was already on his feet, the clipboard slipping from under his arm as every other sound in the hallway seemed to fall away. Is my daughter all right? He asked, and the question came out steady only because fathers like him learned to keep panic folded small until there was time to break. The nurse gave the careful smile hospitals taught for uncertain moments. She is stable. The cardiology team just wants to review one irregular reading before the doctor speaks with you. Stable. Review. Irregular. 3 words that did not belong in the same sentence when it was your child behind the door. Nolan followed her halfway to the station before she handed him a tablet to confirm Emma's monitoring history. He signed, scanned the screen once, then stopped. Most parents would have seen numbers. Nolan saw the device model, the patch version, the flagged event code tucked in one corner of the report. His eyes narrowed. The nurse noticed. Is something wrong? She asked. Nolan looked again to make sure he was not dragging an old ghost into the wrong room. The code was there. Buried, abbreviated, easy to miss unless you had spent years learning what companies changed when they wanted a problem to look smaller than it was. Can I ask where this monitor came from? He said. Through the pediatric grant program, the nurse answered. Why? Nolan did not answer right away. Behind him, he could feel Vivian, her father, and Marjorie standing close enough to hear the air shift. He tapped the corner of the screen with one finger. This event marker should not be attached to that device line, he said quietly. Not unless the firmware rollback failed. The nurse blinked at him. So did Marjorie. Vivian's father gave him a longer look now, not dismissive anymore, but measuring. Vivian herself said nothing for a moment. Then, in a tone sharpened by suspicion more than curiosity, she asked, How would you know that? Nolan turned and saw her clearly for the first time without the emergency of her hand in his. She was beautiful in the way polished steel was beautiful, expensive and exact and cold enough to reflect you back at yourself. But the fear from a minute ago had not disappeared. It had only gone underground. Because I have seen that code before, he said. Marjorie stepped in before Vivian could. Mr. Hayes, are you in medicine? There it was, the class test hidden inside a polite question. Nolan glanced down at his work jacket, at the faded logo from the garage on the chest, then back at her face. No, he said. Not anymore. It was not enough for them, but it was all he intended to give. The nurse, suddenly unsure whether she was standing inside a family matter or a corporate one, excused herself to get the attending cardiologist. Vivian moved closer, lowering her voice. If you are trying to scare people because your daughter had one irregular reading, this is not the place for it. Nolan looked at her, really looked, and understood her in a way he did not like. She was the kind of person who trusted systems because systems had rewarded her for years. Men with wrinkled jackets and worried eyes did not fit inside systems like hers unless they were asking for something. I am not trying to scare anyone, he said. I am trying to understand why my daughter is wearing a monitor tied to an error code that should have been retired. Vivian's face did not change, but one small thing did. She stopped looking at him like a stranger she could manage and started looking at him like a variable she had not planned for. Then the double doors opened again, and before the doctor could speak, a small voice floated out from the exam room. Dad. Emma's voice, thin but brave. Nolan turned instantly. He would have crossed the whole hospital for that one word. But as he moved, his shoulder brushed Vivian's, and he felt her go still beside him when she caught sight of the company name printed at the top of Emma's monitor file, the same company name that belonged to her. Emma was propped up on the exam bed when Nolan stepped into the room, a paper bracelet loose around her wrist, and a brave smile already waiting for him, like she had decided before he came in that she would be the one doing the comforting. They said I get extra orange juice because I was a very cooperative patient, she said, holding up the small cup as if that settled the matter. Nolan crossed to her at once, brushing a hand over her hair, checking her color, her breathing, the steady rise and fall of her shoulders before he let himself answer. You were born overqualified, he said, and Emma smiled for real that time. The cardiologist stood near the monitor with a chart in hand, kind-faced, careful, the sort of doctor who understood that parents listen to the spaces between words more than the words themselves. He explained that Emma had experienced a brief rhythm irregularity during the test, not severe, not currently dangerous, but enough to justify more monitoring before anyone called it harmless. Nolan listened without interrupting, but his eyes kept drifting to the device summary on the screen. Same model line, same event family, same quiet little code tucked where nervous parents would never think to look. Vivian entered the room a moment later with the practiced stillness of someone who had walked into many difficult rooms and preferred being the calmest person inside them. Her father and Marjorie remained outside, visible through the glass in softened shapes and muted colors, waiting without looking like they were waiting. Vivian's gaze moved from Emma to the monitor, then to Nolan. I asked the doctor if there was anything the company should know, she said. It sounded generous on the surface. It also sounded like control. Nolan did not miss either layer. Emma looked between them with that sharp, childlike intuition that caught truth before adults arranged it into something polite. Are you the lady from the hallway? She asked Vivian. The one who needed my dad. Vivian paused, and for the first time since Nolan had seen her, the answer did not come instantly. For a minute, she said. Emma nodded as if that made perfect sense, then took a sip of orange juice and asked, Did it work? Nolan almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because children had a way of walking straight through complicated adult theater and picking up the one honest question left on the floor. Vivian's mouth softened by a fraction. For a minute, she repeated. The doctor excused himself to review another set of readings, and once the door clicked shut, the room changed. The air got quieter, smaller. Nolan stepped closer to the monitor and pointed at the code. That is not random, he said. Vivian folded her arms, defensive without appearing to be. You keep saying that like you expect me to accept it on faith. No, Nolan said. I expect you to read what is in front of you before somebody tells you what you are allowed to call it. Her eyes sharpened. That landed. He could tell by the way she stopped performing certainty and started calculating risk. Emma watched them for another second, then swung her legs slowly off the bed and looked up at Vivian's face with innocent seriousness. You look like the principal when she says everything is fine right before somebody gets called into her office. Vivian blinked. Nolan turned away so Emma would not see the brief surprise on his face. Even now, even scared, his daughter could pull a clean line through the center of a room. Vivian let out the smallest breath, almost a laugh, but too tired to become one. That may be the most accurate thing anyone has said to me all week, she admitted. Emma seemed satisfied with that. Then she studied Vivian a little longer, noticing what Nolan had already noticed in the hallway but had not had time to name. The tension around the mouth. The way one hand pressed subtly against her side, as if holding something in place. the polish that looked expensive from far away and exhausted from 3 feet back. Are you sick too? Emma asked. The question landed gently, but it hit harder than accusation. Vivian looked at Nolan before answering, and in that one glance, he saw something new, something she had kept hidden under tailored fabric and executive timing and that whispered command in the hallway. Not just fear this time. Exposure. She could lie to board members. She could redirect lawyers. She could outlast her father. But a child asking a simple question in a quiet hospital room was a different kind of pressure entirely, because children did not care what version of the truth best protected your image. They only noticed whether your eyes changed before your voice did. For one suspended second, Vivian did not answer Emma's question, and that silence told Nolan more than any polished statement ever could. Then she gave Emma a small smile that looked borrowed from a stronger version of herself, and said, just a little rundown. Emma accepted that the way children sometimes accepted answers they knew were incomplete because they had already learned adults needed places to hide. The cardiologist returned with another nurse and explained that Emma would need to stay for additional monitoring through the afternoon, maybe longer if the readings did not settle into a pattern the team liked. Nolan nodded, asked the practical questions in the order fathers like him always did: insurance, observation, follow-up, school, dance practice, and whether Emma could still have solid food if she got hungry later. He kept his voice even, because panic never helped a child feel safe. But while the doctor answered, Vivian's phone vibrated again and again in her coat pocket, and every time it did, her shoulders tightened by a fraction. When the staff stepped out to arrange the next round of monitoring, she checked the screen at last, then locked it immediately. Nolan did not need to read the messages to know they were not from friends. You're bored, he asked. My father, she said. Those are not always different things. Emma, now curled under a warm hospital blanket with the monitor lead still attached, looked between them and said, You both sound like people who forgot how to eat lunch. It was such a completely Emma sentence that Nolan almost smiled again. He promised her he would get a sandwich from the cafeteria in a few minutes. Vivian glanced toward the door, then back to the screen beside Emma's bed. I want a copy of that report, she said quietly. Nolan studied her face. There was still skepticism there, but not as much of it. Something else had moved in beside it. Concern, maybe, or the first draft of fear. You can ask for a copy, he said. But if you want to understand it, do not let legal touch it first. That landed harder than he expected. Her expression cooled instantly. You make a lot of assumptions for a man who has not told me why he knows any of this. And you trust a lot of systems for a woman standing in a hospital because she clearly does not trust the answer she is about to get. The words hung there between them, too direct to take back. Emma looked from one adult to the other with open interest, like she was watching weather form. Vivian folded her arms, not angry, not exactly, but guarded in the way of people who had built whole careers on staying one step ahead of exposure. Who are you, Mr. Hayes? She asked. Nolan looked at Emma first before answering, because every truth in his life started there now. I used to review clinical safety failures, he said. Independent audits, product recalls, event trails companies hoped would stay invisible. I stopped a long time ago. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Nolan did not answer that right away. Some histories were not secrets. They were scars, and scars did not owe strangers a summary. But then Emma, half sleepy under the blanket, reached for his hand without opening her eyes all the way, and that small motion pulled the old ache forward anyway. Because my wife died after a complication connected to a device line that was supposed to be safer than the one before it, he said. Vivian went still. Not the stillness of control this time. The stillness that came when something inside a person had been hit cleanly enough that all the moving parts stopped at once. Nolan looked at the monitor again, then at the company name stamped in the header of the report. So when I tell you I have seen that code before, he said, I am not guessing. Vivian did not speak. Outside the glass wall, Grant and Marjorie were still waiting, silhouettes blurred by corridor light, pressure standing there in tailored coats. Inside the room, Emma's monitor gave a soft rhythmic pulse, and Vivian finally took one step toward the bed, closer to the child, closer to the screen, closer to a truth she had probably spent years trusting other people to catch before it ever reached her desk. Then her phone vibrated one more time, and when she glanced down at it, the color drained from her face. Nolan could not see the full message, only the subject line before she locked the screen again. Internal review request. Firmware trace. Urgent. The message on Vivian's phone did not stay on the screen long, but Nolan had already seen enough to know what it meant. Internal reviews did not begin in the middle of a hospital day unless somebody, somewhere, had found something that could not be explained away with cleaner language and a better slide deck. Vivian slipped the phone back into her coat pocket like she could still control what happened next by controlling who saw her react. She looked at Emma, then at the monitor, then finally at Nolan. "I need 10 minutes, she said. Nolan did not move. "My daughter needs more than that." Vivian gave a short nod, accepting the hit because she had earned it. "Then come with me." He should have said no. He knew that. Every sensible instinct told him to stay planted beside Emma's bed and let rich people untangle rich people disasters without using his life as their ladder. But before he answered, the monitor at Emma's bedside gave a sharper tone than before, not loud, not dramatic, just wrong in a way fathers heard instantly. Nolan turned at once. The line on the screen had shifted into a pattern he recognized, not catastrophic, not yet, but unstable in a way that made delay dangerous. A nurse stepped in, glanced at the display, and reached for the chart. "It may just be signal noise," she said. Nolan was already beside the bed, eyes on the event trace. "No," he said quietly. "Check the device handshake. Do not just reset the patch." The nurse hesitated. Hospitals were built on hierarchy, and Nolan did not look like hierarchy. Vivian stepped forward. "Do what he said." The nurse looked startled, then obeyed. Another clinician came in, then another. Emma opened her eyes, sleepy and confused more than frightened. Nolan took her hand. "Hey, Peanut, stay with me." Her fingers curled around his, small and warm and trusting, and that nearly undid him more than any alarm could have. On the second screen, the trace expanded. Nolan saw it immediately, the stagger in the firmware response, the lag that could turn one bad reading into a chain of bad assumptions if the machine kept talking to itself the wrong way. "Disconnect wireless sync," he said. "Manual read only." Now, this time the cardiologist heard the authority in his voice before he heard the words. Orders moved. Settings changed. The room tightened around action. Within seconds, the rhythm on the monitor began to settle into something cleaner, something truer. Emma blinked up at him. "Dad?" she whispered. "Why is everybody suddenly listening to you?" Nolan brushed his thumb over her knuckles and said the only answer that mattered. Because they should have sooner. Across the room, Vivian had gone pale in a way expensive makeup could not hide. Not because Emma was in immediate danger now, but because she understood what she was seeing. This was not a nervous father talking too much. This was competence under pressure, old and precise, and very real. Marjorie appeared in the doorway, as if she had felt the shift from down the hall. Grant was behind her, face hardening as he took in the cluster of staff around Emma's bed, the screen frozen on diagnostic traces, the silence Vivian no longer controlled. "What is happening?" he asked. Nolan did not look at him. He was watching the monitor, watching Emma, watching the numbers return to a safer pattern one beat at a time. It was Vivian who answered, and for the first time all day her voice carried none of its usual polish. "I think," she said slowly, staring at the device report like it had just become a confession, "we have been calling this the wrong problem." For the next 20 minutes, no one in the room spoke to Nolan like he was just a worried father in a work jacket. They spoke to him the way people spoke when reality had moved, and they were trying to catch up before it moved again. Emma's readings steadied under manual monitoring, and the color slowly returned to her cheeks, but Nolan knew better than to call that safety. Stable was not the same thing as solved. The cardiologist asked careful follow-up questions now, not dismissive ones. Which device families had Nolan seen this pattern in before? What kind of rollback failure could mimic a random rhythm event? How many cases it usually took before a cluster stopped looking accidental? Nolan answered without drama, the same way a man might explain brake failure or winter road drift, because truth did not need a performance to be dangerous. Vivian stood near the foot of Emma's bed listening to every word, as if each one was removing a brick from under her. Grant did not like that. Nolan could feel it without even looking at him. Men like Grant built lives around being the axis of every room, and nothing unsettled them more than watching authority leave them without permission. "This is still speculation," Grant said at last, his tone clipped and controlled. One child with an irregular reading does not justify panic. Nolan finally turned. No, he said. But one child with an irregular reading and a flagged firmware trace means you start asking better questions before there are 10. Marjorie stepped in smoothly, like she had spent her whole career translating danger into liability. Mr. Hayes, with respect, if you are making claims about a product line, we need credentials, documentation, something verifiable beyond instinct. Nolan might have answered, but Vivian beat him to it. He identified the handshake error before my own review team flagged it, she said. Marjorie looked at her in surprise. Grant looked at her in warning. Vivian did not back down. That was when Emma, half propped against the pillows and still far too observant for a 12-year-old with monitor leads across her chest, looked at Vivian and asked in a quiet voice, "Are they mad because he was right, or because you heard him?" Nobody answered her. Nobody had to. The silence was answer enough. Vivian closed her eyes for one brief second, then pulled her phone from her coat and opened a file Nolan had not known she already had. Her thumb trembled once before she stopped it. 2 years ago, she said, more to herself than anyone else. There was an internal recommendation to delay relaunch until a full firmware audit was completed. Nolan watched her face change as she scrolled. It was not the shock of learning something new. It was worse than that. It was recognition. The kind that arrived when a buried choice came back wearing consequences. Grant took one step forward. Vivian. Just her name, but it sounded like an order. She ignored him. Her eyes moved lower on the page, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone quieter, which made everyone else in the room seem louder by comparison. The delay was overridden. Marjorie's expression sharpened. By whom? Vivian did not answer immediately. She kept staring at the screen like she might still find a version of the record that belonged to someone else. But records did not care what you could live with. When she finally looked up, she did not look at her father first. She looked at Emma, then at Nolan, and only then did she say the words that changed the room for good. By me. The word did not echo in the room, but it might as well have. By me. Vivian did not say it loudly. She did not defend it. She did not reach for the kind of language people used when they wanted to make a terrible decision sound procedural. She only stood there with her phone in her hand and the monitor light reflecting faintly against her face, looking like someone who had just watched a locked door inside herself swing open. Grant recovered first. Men like him usually did. This is not the place for corporate disclosure, he said, every syllable sharpened into control. Emma needs rest. The physicians need room to work. We will handle internal review through proper channels. It was a polished sentence, clean and practiced, and almost insulting in how quickly it tried to turn a child's hospital room back into a boardroom where truth could be rescheduled. Nolan looked at him and felt something colder than anger settle in his chest. He had spent years learning what powerful people sounded like right before they tried to bury consequences under vocabulary. Vivian seemed to hear it too, because for the first time since Nolan had met her, she did not move toward control. She moved away from it. She set the phone down on the side table beside Emma's juice cup and said, "No, we are not doing that again." Marjorie stepped closer, alarm finally cracking through the legal calm she had worn all day. "Vivian, you need counsel before you say another word." "I had counsel," Vivian said. "That was part of the problem." Grant's face hardened. "Enough." Emma, still pale but steady now, looked from one adult to another with the quiet, focused children sometimes had when they knew the room had become more important than anyone wanted to admit. "Did you know it could hurt kids?" she asked. No accusation. Just a question. Vivian turned toward her slowly, and Nolan saw the exact moment this stopped being about stock value, family optics, or legal exposure. It became about whether she could answer a child without hiding behind the version of herself that had built her whole life. "I knew there was a warning," she said. "I told myself it was incomplete. I told myself there would be another review before it reached anyone like you. I told myself the risk was smaller than the delay would cost." Her voice stayed even, but the evenness cost her now. I was wrong. Nolan should have felt satisfaction hearing that. Some part of him had waited years for a person in a tailored coat to admit that the harm did not begin when families started grieving. It began when someone important decided the warning could wait. But standing there beside Emma's bed, hearing Vivian say it without excuse, satisfaction did not come. Only exhaustion did. And something more dangerous than exhaustion. Recognition. Because she had not chosen the lie that protected her most. She had chosen the truth that could take everything. Grant saw that too, and it enraged him. "You are not making policy from a hospital bed and one frightened father," he said. Nolan answered before he could stop himself. "No. She is making it from the moment the consequences finally had a name." The room went still again. Vivian looked at Nolan, and for one brief second all the distance between them changed shape. Not gone. Not healed. Just altered. Less stranger. More witness. Then she picked up her phone, opened the executive group thread, and with Grant watching and Marjorie whispering that this was a mistake, she typed a message with her own hands. Suspend all active. Rollout. Freeze merger briefing. Independent audit effective immediately. Full device trace review. She hit send before anyone could stop her. Her father stared at her, as if she had just set fire to a building he had raised from the foundation. Marjorie exhaled like she already saw the lawsuits lining up in the dark. Emma looked at Vivian and asked the simplest question of all. "Are you still the boss?" Vivian looked at the sent message, then at the men and women around her who had spent years teaching her how power was kept. "Maybe not by tonight," she said. Nolan watched her. This woman who had asked for a fake husband in a hallway because she was terrified of looking alone, and now stood in a child's hospital room, choosing the one thing loneliness had always made expensive for people like her. Truth. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from an unknown number. Federal Review intake request. Clinical safety witness needed. Emma's case attached. He read it once, and when he lifted his eyes, Vivian was already looking at him like she understood exactly what that meant. This was not ending at the hospital. It was only leaving the hallway. By the time the sun had dropped low enough to turn the hospital windows gold, Emma was asleep with one hand still curled around the corner of her blanket. As if even in sleep, she wanted proof that something soft was staying. Nolan sat beside her with the federal message still open on his phone, unread now in the way hard things stayed unread even after you had memorized every word. Clinical safety witness needed. Emma's case attached. Across the room, Vivian stood near the window, no longer taking calls, no longer pretending the silence around her was temporary. News had already started moving faster than people. Grant had left to contain what could still be contained. Marjorie had gone to gather statements and build walls out of language. Somewhere downtown, board members were probably deciding whether Vivian Cole had become a liability before sunset. Somewhere else, parents were probably checking device names on discharge papers they had never thought to question before. Nolan should have been focused only on Emma. He knew that. He had built his whole life around one rule after losing his wife. Keep the world small enough that it could not take more than it already had. Fix cars. Make lunches. Pay bills on time. Get Emma to school, to dance, to bed. Stay away from systems big enough to crush people and call it process. But the problem with old rules was that sometimes life did not break them all at once. It only put your child in the path of the very thing you had spent years avoiding, and then asked what kind of father you were going to be now. Vivian finally turned from the window and crossed the room without the cool certainty she had worn that morning. She looked tired in a way no one in a boardroom would ever have been allowed to see. "My father is asking for my resignation before the markets open," she said. Nolan nodded once. He was not surprised. "Marjorie says if I step down quietly, the company can frame this as a contained review and keep the federal inquiry narrow." He looked up at her then. "And if you do not?" Vivian glanced at Emma first, then back at him. "Then I testify to everything I signed, everything I ignored, and everything I was told would be handled later." Her voice did not shake, but it had lost the polished distance that used to protect it. "If I do that, I do not know what is left of my career." Nolan let that sit between them. It would have been easy to say that careers were a small price next to children in hospital beds. Easy, and maybe even true. But easy truth was for people who had never had to live inside the consequences afterward. Emma stirred under the blanket, opened her eyes halfway, and looked at both of them with that quiet focus children sometimes had when adults forgot they were still in the room. "If she tells the truth now," she asked softly, "does that make her brave or just late?" Neither of them answered. Maybe because there was no answer yet. Maybe because the hardest questions were the ones that refused to stay clean. Vivian moved closer to the bed and brushed a loose strand of hair away from Emma's forehead with a gentleness that looked almost startled to exist in her. "I do not know," she said. At last, Emma nodded sleepily, as if uncertainty itself was an honest enough answer. Then she looked at Nolan. "Are we going home?" He glanced at the message on his phone, then at Vivian, then back at his daughter. Home. The word used to mean distance from trouble. Tonight it sounded more like a direction he was no longer sure how to find. In the hallway outside, footsteps passed, phones rang, doors opened and closed, and the world kept rearranging itself around decisions that could not be undone. Nolan stood, slipped his phone into his pocket, and looked through the glass where the city lights were starting to wake beyond the hospital parking lot. If he walked away now, he could still try to protect Emma from the storm that was coming. If he stayed, he might help stop it from reaching somebody else's child next. Behind him, Vivian said his name very quietly, not like a command this time, not like a request either, but like she already knew whatever he chose would change both their lives. Nolan turned only halfway, enough to see her, not enough to answer. And that was where the night left them. One father with a daughter finally breathing easier. One woman who had told the truth too late to stay innocent, and maybe just early enough to matter, and one question neither of them could escape by morning. When the people who failed you finally choose honesty, do you trust them with the fight ahead, or do you protect your family by leaving them to face it alone?